Now I would like to talk with you about the question that will social media influence critical thinking in this day and age. This interview will take you about 30 minutes to finish, and I have questions to ask you.
Okay.
So, in my view, critical thinking include two definitions I searched on internet. The first definition is that critical thinking include the facts, idea, insights, and intuition. And the other definition is that the critical thinking includes critical reading, critical thinking, and thoughtful writing. So I think that social media will lead to disorder in critical thinking, as people today use the Facebook to post the message, and these messages are worth 100 words or 200 words, and they also post this before thinking. So do you think that will kind of influence the critical thinking habits?
That social media will influence critical thinking? Yeah, I think it can. I think it depends on how people do it. So I think there are a lot of I think there are good examples of and bad examples. So I think, for instance, there are some blogs that I read a lot, like The Root is a site that I read. There's another one called Jezebel. There's one Salon.com. There's another one I read called the Feminist Collective. And these sites that I'm mentioning are people who blog. But they blog about issues with a critical perspective, right? So a lot of these writers write about feminist issues that are happening in pop culture or feminist issues that are happening on social media. And so I think that in that way, they talk about this particular incident, and then they say, okay, let's look at how this incident brings up issues of race or brings up issues of class or gender. And so in that way, I think it's really good and really critical. But those are sites that are sort of dedicated to doing that kind of thinking about like regular things that happen in pop culture, thinking about them more critically. I think if people just post whatever, right, and it's not a site that people write critical things about or talk about from a perspective that's a little bit more robust, then I think it just becomes sort of kind of whatever people's opinions are versus somebody saying, okay, let's talk about like this issue that's happening in pop culture and talk about like how this is indicative of how feminism is changing, right? That's a positive conversation because it's like asking people to think about it deeply, versus just, somebody just throwing something up there and saying, well, my opinion is this, that's different. So I think it's how it's done and who's doing it that makes a difference in whether it becomes critical or not.
Okay, I see. So you think that like deep writing is a kind of way to develop the habit of critical thinking. So like post on Facebook is not a good way of critical thinking or critical writing.
I think it depends on what the post is about. Sometimes people will post things and maybe it's the beginning of an article that they've been writing, right? And so they're like, when people are deep reflections, I think those things can be critical because people are asking questions. I've known people who are doing dissertation research to say, so this is what my research is about, and I wonder what people think about this, right? And they're trying to get people's ideas, right? And so it's kind of like, I think that is a little bit more productive than just somebody saying, this is what happened to me today at work. You know what I mean? I think it's more productive when somebody says, like, I'm coming up against this habit or this trend in my classroom, or I'm doing research on this, or I'm thinking about writing a paper about this, right? And then people start sending them responses. That to me is a more useful way to use it, or to post an article that's written by somebody that is talking about really talking about something from a really critical perspective and really thoughtful perspective. Just posting like, I don't think that such and such people should be let in the country. Well, that's not nuanced and that's not contextualized, and it doesn't think about global politics and, anything that happens. Like, people don't just end up in America, right? They get pulled here for different reasons that have to do with work and labor and their economy and, and so not knowing that and just saying people shouldn't be allowed in this country, like, you're not connecting that to any of these other things. And so I think when people do things like that, it's bad and it's not helpful. But I think when people read articles on blogs that are very, very thoughtful and say, okay, there's lots of reasons why people end up coming to the United States, and some of them have to do with things that the United States does, right? And when people get that perspective, I think that's helpful. Or people say, I'm thinking about writing an article and I want to know what people's ideas are about this. I think that's helpful.
Yeah, I think so.
Yeah.
And so for the critical reading, do you think that checking the news or the opinions from friends and family, do you think that is a kind of way to harm the critical thinking?
to hurt critical thinking.
Yeah.
If your family or friends are not informed, then yes. And you know, I think that people kind of go through stages of sort of being how much they know about certain kinds of things. But I think it's always better if you can have a conversation with somebody who knows multiple perspectives of an issue, right? So, you know, I think normally when I have a conversation maybe about something that's happening, and you know, like an intellectual conversation, I think I normally end up having that with my sister. Because we both have undergrad and master's degrees. We're both pursuing advanced college education. We both took classes about sociology, and you know, we also have had conversations in our classes when we were undergrads that taught us how to like ask questions, right? You know, like provocative questions and thoughtful questions, and like, okay, we've got to bring this perspective in. So because I know she can do that, I can have that conversation with her and say, like, did you hear about this thing that happened on the news? And we can talk about it, and you know, and then it, you know, talk about all the issues that it brings up. I think it's harder for me, at least in my life, to have a conversation with somebody who doesn't have any of that background. So maybe somebody that I go to church with, or I just know in the community.
Yeah.
Because oftentimes they might just say something like, well, you know, that's because of blah, 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 blah. And I'm like, there's no research to support that.
Yeah.
There's nothing out there that supports, like, that's how you feel, but there is actually nothing out there that supports that viewpoint that you're making, right? And so sometimes I try to figure out, okay, so how do I say, like, to this person who's just a regular community member or church member, you know, like, that actually is not really true. And when people say that, this is how people hear that, and you know, so I think if you have family members who can consider multiple sides, or friends who can consider multiple sides and hear what you're saying, I think it's great. But I think if people are just kind of talking like about this is how they feel, or they've just heard something and they're repeating that, and that's a family or a family member or a friend who's repeating that, then I think that's where it becomes negative, because it's not really informed. It's just kind of like this person saying, well, so, you know, we shouldn't let these people in our country. I'm like, wait a minute. Like, these people work in people's homes that you're talking about, and they clean people's homes. You know what I mean? Like, so, it, you know, like, you're saying it as if, like, people are just showing up, like they do, like, so then who would clean your home if these people weren't, you know what I mean? But people don't think of it in that way, right? They're just kind of saying, and that's what I mean by, like, if you have a family member or friend saying that, it's just kind of like coming out of their head versus connecting it to, like, oh, wow, okay, a lot of international women of color come over here and end up doing work in people's homes, you know, and thinking about, like, that's because of globalization and global politics and all that stuff. And people will just say things like, we shouldn't, and I'm like, no, wait, we got to connect that to, like, other things that are happening before you just say we shouldn't, right? You have to understand, like, why it's happening in the first place. And so I think if you have family members and friends who can do that, great. But if they can't do that, or they don't know much about it, then it just ends up being like, here's my opinion about something that I feel shouldn't be allowed, without knowing, like, any of the other context behind it. So, yeah.
Okay. So how do you think that people check the Facebook? I mean, people check the news, or
the news, okay.
Yeah, or something like that on Facebook, or they scan the passage. It's not a good way of critical reading. Do you think that reading with a book, or reading an article will be the best way, rather than reading some articles on Facebook?
So, I think I'll go back to what I said before about, like, your source of where you get things from. You have to definitely try to find sites that talk about these issues in a broader context than just somebody's opinion. That's the first thing. And I think the other thing is you have to supplement what you see on Facebook. So, you know, I've been trained as a researcher, as a qualitative researcher, so I look things up. You know, if I see an article and I want to really know, like, if that happened, I look things up. And there are other sources that I think do sort of the unbiased reporting of news, right? So, you know, the Associated Press or CNN or BBC, right? Those news sources tend to kind of really give you the information that you need, right? Like, this is what's happening in the world today. And I think it's important for me to be in touch with that. So I have no problem looking things up. and trying to see, okay, what are multiple people saying about this, right? Like, okay, CNN is reporting this, Associated Press is, NPR is reporting this. Those things are, I think, helpful. You have to have like multiple sources to get information from. And there are also people that I really like who I think come at it from different angles, but they bring up really important things. So one person that I really like a lot, and I've seen a lot of her clips and things, is Rachel Maddow, who has her own show. Another person is Melissa Harris Perry, who I really like, and so she has been. I kind of started watching a lot of her stuff when Trayvon Martin was murdered, and then his trial happened, and then the person who murdered him was acquitted. I was watching a lot of her show because she was bringing on experts, people who were lawyers and people who were talking about the issues of this case, right? And so, like, what happened? How did it happen? And then people that were cultural critics were talking about the dynamics of race, right, which is a part of the case. So she's like a really good group of people, right, like that come together and kind of have like a thoughtful conversation about it.
Do you think that for a teenager it's very critical for them to finish the writing material by themselves rather than checking the Twitter topic area before they finish their homework? Because actually they are assigned with the homework to talk about the topic that happened recently. I read Miley Cyrus' topic last year, and I saw there are a lot of people on Twitter post their opinions about Miley Cyrus. And one of my friends take the class in Syracuse, and she said she finds the answer on Twitter rather than think about the issue by herself. So do you think that checking Twitter is kind of a way to hurt the habit of critical thinking?
I think Twitter and I think even Facebook are kind of like information portals, right? Like where they find out about things, right? I think it's how they also communicate with each other, and like are sort of in the constant loop of information is coming from that. But I don't think that they are what I would consider like sources if you're going to write some sort of scholarly or academic paper about it. I mean, I think you can write an academic paper about a pop culture icon, but I don't consider Twitter a source, and I don't consider Facebook a source. I read a lot of things on Facebook and Twitter, and some of it's helpful, some of it's not. But I think for a young person, if they're going to want to do a paper, I think you've got to teach them what's a better source to use in terms of like to support or substantiate their argument. So, if it's a link on Twitter to maybe a Huffington Post article, Huffington Post articles tend to be well done and usually tend to be written by people who are cultural critics or professors or scholars in some sort of area, and so they actually provide pretty decent information. But if it's just kind of somebody's random thinking, then that may not be the best Twitter link to use. So you really got to think about like, well, where is it coming from, right? Like, I don't consider like a Twitter post a source. However, I think that a student could do an analysis of a Twitter timeline and look at themes, right? But the analysis would not be without support from articles, right, or scholarly pieces that would help them develop an argument. So I think somebody could look at a timeline of somebody like Miley Cyrus and say, okay, these are the ways that she attempts to connect with her audience and da-da-da-da-da, but they would have had to have learned that knowledge and then apply it to that timeline. Just looking at the timeline itself and trying to write a paper, I don't think is sufficient. But looking at the timeline and saying, you could analyze like her image and her relationship with her fans, right? Looking at the Twitter timeline. And then there's theories about that, right? We've talked about these things in class, looking at the medium itself and how that medium gets used. You could use a media-centered approach and you could analyze, Miley Cyrus's Twitter timeline and her image. Certainly. But just looking at her timeline to write a paper, and using that as a source would not work, but you could certainly analyze it as a text using an approach and say, okay, so, you know, like, she attempts to create a relationship with her viewers this way. If you look at her Twitter timeline, these are the things that she posts about, and this is what this means, right? But as a source for like a paper, no. As a text to analyze and look at and see themes, yes, you could analyze that, yes.
So do you think that for the routine critical thinking, that's not include writing for a paper, or like talking with others or make arguments with others, like checking Facebook or Twitter do you think that would be a great way to cultivate critical thinking?
Not by itself. I don't think you can just check Facebook by itself. I think you have to cultivate critical thinking through, I think you do it through conversation, you know. So, you know, like I remember being younger and things would happen, and my mom would say, you know, so let's talk about X, Y, and Z thing that's happening. And so, you know, and then it becomes a conversation, right? Like in which, you know, she's, how do you feel about that? You know, da 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 da. What does this mean? You know, and even to like, and you know, it's just kind of be with personal things, right? But she wanted, you know, you to be able to talk about it and have kind of express how you feel about it. I think one of the things that, you know, is even more helpful as I think about it now is you know, so something happens and to sit down and say, okay, so like, you know, oftentimes I think like with movies or television, you know, being able to say to a young person, so I notice you like, you know, movies where there's a lot of like violence or whatever, you know, why do you like those kinds of movies? Tell me about that, you know, like how come the women are always in the background in the movies? You know what I mean? Like that is beginning to sort of cultivate, excuse me, that critical conversation, right? Of helping them to realize like, oh wow, the women are always like kind of in the background and the men are always in the front. Why is that? You know, to make you, I think you can do it through conversation. But then I think you also have to like, I think you need to be able to be a person that I think is a little bit well-read, meaning that you've read a lot of different things, so that you have like a lot of sources, right, like to pull on, right? So, you know, even if you hear about something or you see something, you can say, okay, like let me think about this realistically. And, you know, for me, a lot of times I can, when there's an incident that happens in the news or there's a high-profile story, I can think of one or two books that I have read that totally relate, right? Like scholarly books that totally relate, right? And I can say, this is the same argument that such and such a person made, right? I think you have to be able to do that in your brain to do some critical thinking, is to be able to say, you know, like this is like what such and such an author wrote about in 1999 or where, you know, whatever it is. And I think that's how the critical thinking starts happening, is when you can make those connections between somebody else who's made the same argument and what you're seeing now. I think so I think you have to sort of be well-read and exposed to a lot of different things to do that. And I think writing about those things and learning how to write about those things, right, whether it's an assignment that you get in school or an assignment through some sort of a community program or a camp, that allows you to like engage with something and say, okay, like here are all the perspectives that you can take on this. Having the ability to practice that and to be able to say, this is one perspective, this is another perspective, and this is a whole other perspective. And there are people who've written about this that can inform this conversation. Being able to engage with that and doing that, I think helps you become better at seeing like how there are many different ways that you could look at something. And I think that helps enhance your critical thinking when you have to, you know, take a paper. And I'll say to students all the time, like, you're not taking a position, right? Like, I'm asking you to explore an idea. And the process of exploring that idea means you look at all the possible perspectives that people take towards that idea, right? Yeah. And that's more like sort of for me, like where the critical thinking piece comes in.
Okay, so is there anything else you want to add to the topic of social media will influence the critical thinking?
Anything else I want to add? I'm trying to think if there's anything really critical critical. I mean, I think. I don't think so. I think there is an idea out there that like social media in itself is bad, and people aren't critical with people, and it causes people not to be. It causes people not to be critical, and that's not my position. I think it's what people do with it and how they use it, and I think we've seen people do, I think, incredibly useful things with social media that I would consider in the realm of activism. So I think like a lot of the hashtags and the timeline after Mike Brown was killed, right? That was all of these young African American folks putting up pictures of themselves and saying, if I was killed, what for? Like I think it's an amazing way, right, to represent like social activism and social movement, and to represent an issue. So I think we got to think about it more like what are people doing with it, right? And like I said, so if people are writing a paper about Miley Cyrus and they're using her Twitter feed as a source, I'm gonna buy that. But if they want to analyze her Twitter feed and talk about her image, right? And they want to analyze it using some sort of scholarly information, then I think we've got something going on there, right? Because they're looking at that as a text, right? Not as a source, as a text that we can see. Okay, so this is how she creates her image and her idea. But so I think the question really is, what is it that young people are doing with it, right? I think we've seen incredible amounts of people. I think some of the photos we've seen come out of Ferguson wouldn't exist if it wasn't for social media. So I don't like to demonize social media as like bad, like as a medium.
Yeah.
I think that's what people do with it, where they get the information from. And so a lot of times I will post things from certain spaces because I know that the way that they talk about that issue is much more thoughtful and robust, and will bring up issues that other people on my timeline aren't thinking about that are related. And so, and so sometimes I think that in itself is helpful. Is the source of where you're getting things from, right? Like, so people may not know, like, oh, this isn't a source that really delves into this deeply, right? But a lot of times I will post things because I know this author writes about, or this blogger writes about these issues in a really good way. And so, like, she'll bring up things that people aren't thinking about on my timeline. I know they aren't thinking about, and so I'll post it and see if people have, and then it's kind of see what people's reactions are. But I think you have to, again, like, think about how people are using it, right? If you're reading somebody who really is, like, saying, okay, let's talk about the politics of how this is getting represented, that's great. Or, it's just their opinion about something, I think that's less useful. So I think it has to do with the way we use social media. And I think you can use it to prompt critical thinking. Oftentimes I think with young people, like, if you can use social media as an opening point, right? Like, so how many people saw this? Okay, why did this happen? Where did it originate? What's going on, right? Like, then you can, it's how you direct the conversation, I think, and how you use it versus just the medium itself. So, I mean, I guess I would say, like, social media is not bad. It's what you're doing with it, and how you use it that can promote critical thinking, and it just depends on how you structure that. If it's just something you're looking at and you're like, I don't get what they're doing, then you miss the point, right? If you understand that now in 2014, like, students can use online and images, right, to connect whole communities of people, right? We're thinking and feeling the same thing at a time in this nation when certain things are happening, then you see it more as activism, right? That's critical. That's much more critical consciousness than just, oh, look at her dress she put on her Twitter timeline. You know what I mean? Like, when young people are feeling that they can mobilize in that way, they can use social media to speak back to something that's happening to them in their community. Like, I see that as critical, and I see that as conscious. What Kim Kardashian wore to whatever award show, I don't care about. You know what I mean? So I think that's how we have to sort of make that distinction about critical thinking and social media. So.
Okay.
Okay?
Yeah, thank you.
You're welcome.